The 2000s were a pivotal time for nerd media. Activities such as playing video games were starting to really break into the mainstream, and the media of this era reflected that. While there's plenty of examples of this 2000s nerd media vibe, one of the most long-lasting is Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim is a series that has a very complicated relationship with many parts of itself, including its colorful cast of characters. Throughout each adaptation, we often see many of the characters change their roles or get cut, which is natural. When you're adapting a piece of media, sometimes you need to change things. However, I think the most interesting example of the series changing its characters actually comes from something a bit more subtle, the evolution of its queer characters. It's a very conscious change that has subtly shifted the franchise's tone. So, I thought it would be interesting to analyze this change and see how Scott Pilgrim has become emblematic of the ongoing evolution of queer media. Obviously, there are spoilers ahead for the entire Scott Pilgrim franchise, so I'd recommend tuning out now if you want to keep yourself from being spoiled. But otherwise, let's get fruity and analyze the queer evolution of Scott Pilgrim. I find the queerness of the graphic novels to be noteworthy because it's arguably some of the most prevalent in the entire series, with many positive moments, but also some head scratchers. On the positive side, we have Wallace Wells. I actually think Wallace is really great for the most part. I feel like whenever he gets introduced as Scott's gay roommate, it's not just because the graphic novels want that to be his only trait, but because Scott is kind of a chump, and does see that as one of Wallace's big traits. Wallace has a lot of the gay jokes that you would expect, but they're usually pretty funny and feel in line with the series' tone. Wallace is also much more than what the book lets on at first. Throughout the entire series, he sometimes acts as Scott's backbone. He offers advice to him such as trying to help him overcome his fear of envy being back. It's really sweet, and moments like that make Wallace one of my favorite characters in the entire series. Sure, Wallace is mostly remembered for being the funny gay guy, but he also is kind of one of the most genuine characters in this entire franchise. He has flaws and acts like an asshole sometimes, but at the end of the day, he does care about Scott, and that shines through. Wallace is one of the most well-written characters in the entire series by far. Wallace also gets one of the most wholesome relationships in the entire franchise. We see him get a boyfriend named Mobile, and their relationship seems pretty healthy. They're happy with each other, and it seems like a functional relationship based on its portrayal in the graphic novel and anime. Another really positive example of gay men in Scott Pilgrim is Stephen Stills. At the start of the series, he isn't gay, and we see him struggle to maintain a relationship with Julie. Then, towards the back half of the series, he starts a relationship with Joseph, and he seems extremely happy in it. Characters react positively, including Scott, who loses his mind. I really appreciate this progression of Stephen's character, because he comes out, but it's not like the book drops everything to make a big fuss out of it. On the flip side of the writing quality spectrum, we have the female queer characters. The 2000s were an interesting time where we pushed towards queer acceptance and more queer representation in media, but at the same time, a lot of it can be very questionable in retrospect. One of the worst examples of Scott Pilgrim and how it handles queer people is how it plays into the gross fetishization of gay and bisexual women as being, quote-unquote, sexy. Essentially, to make a long story short, there's a historical standard for women making out being seen as more acceptable or sexy than gay men, or if it's not sexy, it's portrayed as just a phase. This is extremely problematic because it turns making out with women into something for the audience to ogle at, or makes the punchline where clearly the women are just confused and don't know what they're thinking. Rather than bi-curious being a valid form of identity, it becomes a joke. I bring this up because that's arguably what a lot of the queer representation in the graphic novels ends up being, especially for the female characters. There's a lot of times where we just see bisexuality used as a punchline and labeled as just a phase. The worst example of that is when Kim and Knives have a drunk makeout in Volume 4. It's really gross, and considering that the volume literally emphasizes just a few pages prior to this that Knives is still a minor, it's kinda tasteless. It's also a joke about, oh, let's never think about this again, which further adds to the tastelessness of it, because it's kind of just a weird moment that honestly makes me really uncomfortable every time I reread the series. It feels like it comes out of nowhere and doesn't give any further insight into Knives or Kim. It feels more like shock value or fetishization. However, if I'm being honest, as much as I hate this scene, I'm pretty sure it's one of the first times that it registered for middle school me that women can kiss each other, and that was kind of a life-changing realization. However, the most significant piece of female queer representation is the romance between Roxie and Ramona. Honestly, this is one of the most mixed bag aspects in this series for me, but I do lean more positive on it. On one hand, I think it's a romance that reveals Scott's flaws in a really unique way. It feels like the egg is on Scott's face because he gets overly upset and worried about Ramona's past, in major part due to her dating a woman at one point. Scott becomes overly paranoid and he has to learn to confront himself on this, and I think there's some cool commentary you can do there, dissecting Scott's own possible flawed perception of bisexuals, and how that creates his paranoia of Ramona cheating on him with a woman. On the flip side, I feel like they don't do enough exploration of that here. A lot of this arc is spent more so on Scott and Lisa, which makes sense. Obviously, that's a huge part of Scott's growth, and it's a pivotal moment in the graphic novels. However, I wish they did lend more time to explain Ramona and Roxie, and touching on aspects besides how it affects Scott. In general, a lot of the exes aren't ever that well developed, but it sucks here because Roxie and Ramona had by far the most storytelling potential. I do feel like a lot of the writing flaws I have with this romance are more so general writing flaws that Scott Pilgrim has, and not intentional mean-spirited writing. At the end of the day, while Scott Pilgrim isn't a masterclass in queer representation, for a 2000s graphic novel series, it is remarkably queer. There's multiple prominent gay characters, one of which goes through the coming out process, and bisexuality is dabbled in. It's incredibly easy to see why Scott Pilgrim was latched onto by a subsection of queer people. In a way, a lot of the flaws that I spent so much time putting under a microscope only matter because I'm holding a piece of media from nearly 20 years ago up to modern standards. Of course it's not going to perfectly hold up. However, these characters are so well written that it's easy to fall in love with them. They're not just characters who have well written queerness, they also just feel like real people. While the pool of queer media is ever expanding, it's still hard to find characters that feel as well-rounded as some of the Scott Pilgrim characters. They're queer, funny, shitty, and so many more adjectives. I don't want to say that they're easy to relate to, but they're certainly characters that people have connected with for a variety of reasons, and in part that's because of their queerness. Speaking personally, the queerness of this series was important to me as a kid. I knew of gay people before reading Scott Pilgrim, but seeing such a wide array of queer people led to me becoming the homo I am today. Nowadays, I find myself connecting pretty hard to Kim, besides the whole kissing a minor thing. I feel like analyzing the queerness of the graphic novel gave me a newfound appreciation for it. While I always appreciate it in the back of my mind, there's a reason that gay people are attracted to this series like moths to a flame. It's queer as hell, but also allows its characters to breathe and be complex people who are not just the gay ones.
And you didn't bang her? Are you gay?
To be honest, there's not a lot to talk about with the movie's queerness. The gayest thing in this movie is by far Wallace Wells, who is my goat as always. Wallace gets like 70% of my favorite jokes, including one where Scott says that he doesn't want him there out of fear of him gaying up the place. How Wallace continuously gets more men in his bed. Wallace is one of the most important characters in the entire movie who honestly helps give Scott a lot of his growth. It's not like Wallace was unimportant in the comics, but with most of the cast getting reduced roles in the movie, Wallace ends up really shining throughout this entire film, and ends up being one of the most fleshed out characters. On the flip side, Roxie is one of the film's least fleshed out characters. The film ends up doing the whole, I was just bi-curious bit, which is a little silly. Like, obviously bi-curious people exist in real life, but I've never been a fan of how the film has Ramona somewhat discard this relationship by calling it just a phase. It feels like she is weirdly embarrassed about it, which just slightly plays into the whole it was just a phase trope that is often assigned to women dating other women. The scene has other weird moments, such as Roxie calling Ramona a has-been, and they assign Roxie the back of the knees weakness that Envy has in the graphic novels, which ends up turning her death into a sex joke. It's not the end of the world, but it does lead to Roxie feeling more like an exaggerated version of herself, where her only personality is being the quirky ex when Ramona was curious. It's really disappointing considering how in the graphic novels and Takes Off, Roxie is usually used to reveal something interesting about the characters, and while here she is still used to make Scott insecure, this arc ends up lacking a lot of the depth that its graphic novel counterpart has. I don't think it was intentionally mean-spirited, because clearly every ex in this film has virtually no depth, but it's just kind of unfortunate that they wasted the opportunity to do anything interesting with Roxie, besides using Ramona's past bi-curiousness as a vehicle for Scott to get angry about Ramona keeping secrets. However, I do love the bi-furious joke. At the end of the day, I don't really blame the movie for cutting out and simplifying the queer stuff that much. It was already a lot to cram the entire plot into a 2-hour film, and it strains itself even when dumping other more important plot elements. We lose the Kim and Knives stuff, which is honestly fine because I don't like it that much anyway, and Roxie is pretty much just a punchline used to push forward the plot, but at least Wallace is still intact and gets a prominent role. But wait, Kim, what about the other Scott Pilgrim piece of media from 2010? The game! Well, there's not much to say there because the game is a pretty simple beat 'em up, but it does feature a little animation where Knives kisses Kim, and an ending where they get together, and it's kinda whack, but at this point, whatever. It's nowhere near as bad as what happens in the graphic novel. I wish that the Kim and Knives stuff never happened, and it's unfortunate that the only part of this franchise that ignores it is the movie. After around a decade of silence, the Scott Pilgrim IP miraculously came back with a brand new Netflix anime. I was super excited because I was hopeful that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off would adapt all of the best parts of the graphic novel, sprinkle in the comedic timing and flair of the movie, while polishing the numerous rough edges. But instead, it did something unexpected. It took the entirety of Scott Pilgrim and reanalyzed it from a new perspective, with not just the story, but also its queer representation. Ramona and Roxie go from one of the more underdeveloped relationships and being somewhat of a punchline, to an actual heartfelt exploration of abandonment. I think it's really special that they made Roxie one of the most important characters in the show. Her and Ramona fighting kickstarts Ramona's entire arc of revisiting how she acted with her exes, and learning to not run from the past. Most importantly, it avoids one of my least favorite tropes: queer romances ending in tragedy. I know that's a somewhat broad brush to say that fictional queer romances always end in tragedy, because there's plenty of healthy fictional queer relationships, but a good amount of queer stories on some level deal with the tragedy of being queer and heartbreak relating to it. Rather than the emotional baggage never being resolved, we get one of the most emotional scenes of the entire show, where Ramona realizes that she did fail Roxie by abandoning her, and that she hurt Roxie by being so flippant. It's genuinely one of my favorite moments in this entire franchise, where Ramona has to come to terms with her mistakes. In this episode, we see her literally downplay Roxie as just a college roommate, rather than fully acknowledging her status as being a past partner. This entire scene rocks, and it feels like such a quantum leap compared to the movie, because it humanizes their relationship. Even when they do go for jokes such as Kim and Roxie kissing, the joke isn't necessarily just, haha, bisexuality. Like, on some level, the joke relates to bi-curious stuff. But the joke feels less like a character attempting weird bi-erasure and more like a genuinely silly moment. Another big example of Takes Off really revamping the queerness of the series is with Kim and Knives. As mentioned earlier in the video, I'm not a huge fan of Kim and Knives as a general pairing, but here it feels at least a lot less weird. Instead of, ooga booga, women make out in a closet, their moment together is them jamming out on instruments, which feels so genuine considering that it becomes a massive character growth moment for Knives. It's another example of queerness and Takes Off being not just a punchline or fun character trait, but something that can be integrated into character growth in a natural way. It makes these characters feel more whole without being weird about it. However, Takes Off isn't all character growth with its queerness. Sometimes it lets itself just go bonkers. Wallace has by far the most fun gay arc in this entire show. If there's one thing that is consistent throughout this entire franchise, it's Wallace's gayness being used for some genuinely S-tier comedy. The highlight of this all, and honestly one of the highlights of the show in general, comes in the 4th episode. I love the little riff on straight actors playing gay characters with the whole straight Wallace thing, and who can forget the entire Todd arc. Todd and Wallace having gay sex isn't something I really ever expected or wanted, but deep down, it's what my soul needed. It's so over the top and silly. Sometimes, hot steamy gay sex is truly one of the funniest things in the world. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off isn't the definitive piece of queer media, because that's something that can't really exist, but it does a spectacular job at portraying some of the realities of being queer. I feel like sometimes when writers aim to make queer characters, they accidentally miss the mark a little. My queerness is a major part of my life and identity, but I feel like occasionally in media, portrayals of queerness have to sacrifice normal character interactions for the sake of queer themes, which for sure has its place, but it shouldn't be the only type of queer media that exists. I feel like Scott Pilgrim handles things in a great way. It gives us characters who are queer, and it's just like part of them. Their romantic heartbreaks don't have much to do with their queerness. They just experience heartbreak for reasons that cishet characters get to experience heartbreak for. The queer characters of Scott Pilgrim just feel like part of the cast, which is sublime. I like how normal everything feels, which is such a big step up from where we were in the past. Prior, I felt like the queer characters were mostly reserved for punchlines or moments that, while not homophobic, push the characters to the sidelines a bit. Takes Off feels like a natural progression because that's where we are as a society. It's a long step up from where we were in the past, and it's beautiful to get to see the past 20-ish years of queer media growth get represented in one franchise. And I honestly hope that more shows take notes from Takes Off on how to do queer characters. It really helps expand the world to just see these people exist in it and navigate it, from the hardships to the silliness of it all. Queer media is an ever-evolving landscape, and these days, we're finally reaching a point where queer characters can get to just exist as part of media. Their queerness doesn't need to be a plot point that separates them or makes them a comedic relief, and that's something to celebrate. As a queer person, it's really meaningful to see Scott Pilgrim take the time to get things right. Takes Off is a milestone in many ways, because it feels like the show fixed many of the franchise's biggest flaws, such as the exes lacking depth, and I'm glad that level of care was extended to the queer characters. This series has been part of my life since middle school, It's cool to see as I've grown more comfortable with my queerness, Scott Pilgrim has too.
No sparks. Worth a shot.